Welcome back to the We've All Been There podcast. I am Maximiliano Striplin, and I get the huge opportunity to be the youth pastor here at Lifegate Church, and I'm joined with my fearless leader, Pastor Chad. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. I love it. It gets better every time. Every intro, it just gets better and better to work here at Lifegate. I love it. So cool. Yeah, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
It's Easter week.
Yes,
I can't believe we're recording a podcast on Easter week. This is Tuesday. We're just a few days away from the biggest kind of weekend for the church. And but man, I'm excited for Easter. As a pastor, I'm always excited to see it come and excited to see it go,
For sure.
And but I think it's going to be a great Easter, and it seems like everybody's kind of doing what they need to do and getting things going. And
we're going to make it happen.
Yeah, I think we're all pitching in, and any pastors or leaders that are out there that are listening, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And those that are church volunteers, I'm talking about. It's a busy week, but we carved out some time to do this. Now, we don't have a lot of time to banter, though, today because
we got to get down to business.
Man, we've got a good amount of content here.
That's right.
On this subject that, I thought it was cool that you want to do this subject. We'll talk back and forth about what do we want to talk about on the podcast. Sometimes I'll have an idea. Sometimes you'll have one or whatever. And you had this idea for this month's podcast, and I thought, isn't that cool that someone from your generation would want to talk about submission?
Come on, somebody.
Yeah,
That's right.
We've all been submitted.
We've all been submitted. Yeah, so by definition, to submit means to accept or to yield to superior force or the authority or will of another person. Or another definition defines it as subject to a particular process, treatment, or condition. And whether we know it or not, we've all been submitted at some point, whether it be by the first definition to someone or by the second definition to something. So, Pastor, what does submission mean to you?
Yeah, well, you asked me this when we were working on the material, and I just started writing, and I just what does it mean? I don't know. And so this is what just kind of came out.
Yeah.
I think that it means to be under.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we all want to be over something. Nobody really wants to be under anything because we like to be in control, and we like to run our own lives, and we like to make our own decisions. But there is this biblical principle that before you can be over something, you have to learn to be under something or someone. Now, of course, we know that we are all submitted to Christ, that someone ultimately is Christ, that we are called to live our lives in submission to Him. And, sometimes, though, that submission to Christ comes in the form of submission to someone that Christ has put over us. And so when we submit to those in authority over us, we're actually submitting to Christ because we believe He's the one that ultimately sets authority anyway. So I think submission means, hey, I'm going to be under. But the good thing about being under is that when I learn how to be under, then He can put me over. And I think you can preach that right there.
Hello, somebody. Yeah, I mean, growing up, I submitted to my parents for sure.
Yep.
I mean, if they wanted me to do something, I would do it. And in that, I submitted to the process of growing up. So it was being submitted to someone and to something, the process of growing up and maturing. And early on, before my mom met my stepdad, it was just me and her. So I trusted her and respected her authority over my life because she didn't leave my side. She kind of functioned as both parents. And when our family kind of shunned us out, she kind of stepped up to the plate and led me. And so for me, because of those early years, because of my mom's motives and intentions to just be a good mom, I had a good regard for what it looked like to submit under someone. And so whenever my dad came in the picture, even though there were moments that maybe I didn't agree with my mom or dad about something, I knew that I could trust their authority. I knew I could submit to them because they had proven time and time and time again that they were somebody that was trustworthy. And so even though I know for some people submission and even that word of submitting to something may sound painful or ugly or scary, and it looks different for everybody, right?
Yeah,
I mean, depending on how your parents were, if you had quote unquote good or bad parents, bad teachers, bad coaches, even bad pastors, quote unquote, right?
Yeah.
That can create a problem with authority. It can create a problem with submission. And so we want to be our own boss. We want to do things our own way. And I know that can give us a bias towards what submission is supposed to be like and what was supposed to happen. But I know that growing up, I saw that submission kind of was stereotyped, that the only people that submit are those that are either weak, that are poor, or women. And so for me, I saw that and I was like, well, that doesn't seem right, because I learned early on submitting to my mom, who was a female, and not having a dad. I saw that I could submit to her and I can submit to other people, and that can be something that would be good. So I think it'd be good for us to say what submission is and is not. And I know you got a few on those, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I just came up with this. I looked it up online, and I liked this definition, and then I had another thought about it. But the definition, you kind of already said something similar to this, but submission means to voluntarily take a position where you put your trust in someone else and heed their leadership. And so there's a big part in there is that trust part. And you just talked about that for people who this is a struggle to submit. Sometimes it does come down to trust, and it does come down to, like you said, I can submit to my mom because I trusted her. I trusted that she had good intentions for me. But if you've had experiences where you had people that were in an authority position but didn't necessarily have good good intentions for you, becomes more difficult, definitely, to submit or to even trust other people who might have good intentions, because it comes down to that word trust. And so that's where I kind of came to this thought, and that submission is ultimately about trusting God. And so if God is the one who sets up authority, and if I really believe that God has good intentions and plans for my life, then I could submit to the authorities that he has placed in my life, because ultimately I trust that even if that authority may not have good intentions for me, he has good intentions for me. And if I'll do things his way, then he's gonna bring his blessings. It made me think of a story in my own life. You know, we came here to plant Lifegate Church in 2006. That's been, 18 years ago. It's crazy. But I remember knowing what God had put in our hearts to plant a church, and yet we were and are part of a fellowship, the Assemblies of God, and we were from a different district, so we would be coming into the North Texas district to plant a church, and there's a process. And part of that process was that I had to meet with the presbyter and the committee, and I had to get approval to come to Burleson and plant a church. Now, I knew what God had put in our heart. I knew that God had called us to come to Burleson. It was very clear to me. But those people that really had the ultimate authority to say whether we could come to Burleson or not, they didn't have the same word from God that I did. I was brand new to them. They didn't know me. And so I'm coming in, sharing our story and asking for kind of that approval or that permission to plant a church here. And there was an authority structure that was set up. And I remember thinking, like, are they going to approve me? And if they don't, what am I going to do? I know God called me to come to Burleson, so if they don't approve us to come plant the Assembly of God Church, are we going to just be a non-denominational church and go there anyway, or what are we going to do? And I remember just going, God, I'm submitting to the process. I know, God, that if you spoke to me, then you can also speak to them. And these are people that you have, because of my heritage and because of the fact that we have been a part of the Assemblies of God for my whole life, and this is who we are. I'm submitted to their process and to their people and to all those things. And I remember being nervous about it and thinking, what will I do? Like, well, I guess I'm going to go where they tell me to go or whatever. But trusting God, I know that, if this is what you've called me to do, you spoke to me, you can also speak to them, and I'm submitted to that. And ultimately, that is what happened. They heard the voice of God as well and said, we do feel like, you're called to come here and plant a church in Burleson, and they allowed us to do that, even though there were already a couple other churches. And at that time, it was like, hey, we'd rather you go somewhere where there's not another Assembly of God church. But being in submission to that brought God's favor and his blessings. In fact, in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 5, it talks about this. It says, in the same way, you who are younger, submit yourself to your elders. All you clothe yourself with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. You know, a lot of times we want to lift ourselves up and we want to make a way for ourselves, but God actually calls us to lay ourselves down.
Yeah.
So if we will lay ourselves down, then he will lift us up in his way and in his timing, because we humbled ourselves and we submit ourselves to him and to the authority, the process that he has placed in our lives. And so I think it's so important to realize that submission really is about trust, and it's mostly about trusting God.
Yeah. As you were talking about that, I just had this thought, and it's something I wrote down a while ago, and I kind of made it my own. But in that moment where they hadn't heard that word, you had a choice. You could either get over it or you could get under him.
Ooh, I like that. Yeah.
You could either get over it or you could get under him. And if you got over it, and I think for a lot of us, when things don't go our way, we can just be like, I'm going to get over it. And you go your own way to try to make it work and to make it happen. Like, even like you said, are we going to become a non-denom church, or are we going to do something else? We're going to go to a different city. You know, you have all these options and thoughts, but you don't need to get over it. You need to get under him. And because you trusted those people of authority under God, then you knew, well, this is something that I'm going to have to get under God in. I'm going to trust him that he knows what he's doing.
And here's the thing is, I didn't know those people and they didn't know me. So I didn't know if they were trustworthy, but I knew God was trustworthy. And so I knew that if I would submit myself to the people that he had placed over me, even though I didn't know them and didn't know if I could trust them, that ultimately he would get me where he wanted me to be. And it could have even been that could have been part of his process to get me in some other city that I didn't even know I was supposed to be in. But ultimately for us, it was that, you know, they agreed that they felt like God was calling us here to Burleson as well. But because I didn't know if I could trust them, but because I could trust him, then he got me and got us where he wanted us to be.
Yeah. Okay. Tell us what submission is not.
What submission is not. Man, I went to town on this one. I put a whole bunch of stuff. And so I won't take a long time on each one. I'll just kind of hit. Yeah. So I think submission is not never asking a question or bringing any feedback. I think sometimes we get in our mind that, well, I'm submitted to my pastor or submitted to my boss or whatever. That means I can never speak up, or I can never ask a question, or I can't ever bring any constructive feedback. But that's not what submission is. You know, submission is, hey, I might ask a question, or I might even bring some constructive feedback in the right way, but I'm submitted to, if my boss or my pastor chooses to use it, then great. And if he chooses not to use it, then that's okay too, right?
Yep.
So it's not never asking a question or bringing feedback. Here's another one. Submission is not doing something that you know is wrong or goes against your conscience just because someone in authority told you to do it.
Ooh.
So submission is not going, well, my boss told me to do it, or somebody in authority told me that I needed to do that, but it's going against my conscience, or it's going against what I know is wrong. No, that's not submission. Another one is, submission is not being afraid of those who are your leaders. I think sometimes we think, well, I got to fear the boss, fear the pastor, No, I don't think that's the way it should be at all. I think there should be a healthy respect, but not a fear of those that are in authority. Here's another one. Submission is not allowing yourself to be taken advantage of or abused by someone who might try to abuse their authority. So just because you're submitted to someone doesn't mean that they can take advantage of you or abuse you. So that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about submission. Now, I will say this. Abuse is not someone lovingly correcting or disciplining you. And sometimes we can go, oh, well, they told me something I didn't want to hear, or they tried to help me, they corrected me, they disciplined me. That's abuse. No. That's not necessarily abuse if it's done in a loving and a correct way. Some people can abuse their authority, and so submission is not that I have to just submit even when someone's abusing their authority. So you have to understand the difference there.
For sure.
Last one I had here is, submission is not staying somewhere when you can't align with the vision or mission. And I wrote this down, that there might come a time, say you're working at a church or something like that, when you know the vision that God has put in your heart is different than the vision of the place that you are serving. And in that case, that's when you need to lovingly and peacefully make arrangements to go somewhere that you can fully support and submit to the vision. And that doesn't mean just some flippant decision. Well, I don't like what's going on there, and so I'm just going to run over somewhere else. But it's more of a fully processed in prayer and with good counsel. I'm going, hey, you know what? I don't agree with the vision here, but I'm going to, in a loving and peaceful way, make arrangements over time to get somewhere where I fully do submit to and support the vision. And if and when that time comes, you're still submitted to the process and not trying to burn the place down while you're leaving. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, super true. I just had one thing on what submission is not, and I just put down that submission is not idolatry. It's not idolatry.
Oh, that's good.
And I think there's a fine line between honor and idolization, right? Like someone maybe, and this is something I've heard just from, conversations with other pastors, is you can either be called to a city, you can be called to a people, or you can be called to a pastor. And so for me, like personally, and I'll get more into it later, but I felt called to the pastors here. And so for me, I have to be careful in that, that when I'm like, well, not necessarily called to the city or the people, blah, 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 all these different things, but if I'm called to, serve underneath your leadership, that doesn't mean I'm idolizing your leadership. And so I think it's very, it can be a very dangerous thing when we idolize the people that we are serving under and are submitted to, because only God gets to tell you, hey, this is what the scriptures say. This is what my word says. And you can't receive what they say as scripture. And I think it's you can get into a dangerous spot when they say, well, I think God wants you to do this. Well, you said it, so I'm submitted to you. No,
you've got to go. I am also submitting what you said to God. And what is God saying there? What does his word say? And what is he saying to my spirit and in my spirit? And I think that's such a good, important point. And I think, there's two ways to go there.
Yeah.
Sometimes people idolize their leader, put them on a pedestal, and there's no leader that's perfect.
That's
they're going to blow it. Other people demonize their leader. And, because they're an authority, they're constantly, telling me what to do and whatever. And anybody that's over me, you can't trust them. And so neither one of those are healthy places to be. But instead, it should be, hey, I'm submitted to God. And he does allow people to be in authority over me. But everything, even of the people that are in authority over me, whether it's good or bad, I'm taking that and then submitting that to God to see what his word says and what his spirit is saying, and do those things line up with what he's saying to me. Yeah,
that's so good. So I think we should go into like some benefits of submission, of submitting. And I just had a few kind of quick ones on this one too. And then I know you got a few as well, but first, you go through the process of improvement. By definition, that is what submitting means. And what's super cool is that anytime you submit to something, you're committed to a process. So wherever you started, that's not where you're going to end when you submit to something. You create close relationships. When you're submitted to something together, it creates unity.
Yeah.
What's super cool is if on our team, everybody is submitted to the vision of Lifegate Church, then we all have something in common. And that's what I love about working at a church personally, is that when I was working at Chick-fil-A, at the end of the day, like whether anybody knows it or not, we're trying to make money.
Yeah.
We're selling chicken.
Yeah.
And so even though we do have values and all these different things, at the end of the day, like even though I was a certain level of leadership, the regular team member, they're just making money.
They're just trying to make money. Yeah.
But here at church and on a team, and hopefully wherever you're at, we are all committed to creating moments and changing lives, to see people have an experience that changes their life forever. And so we create a close relationship to that because we're all kind of on the same page.
I think there's a thin line there, though, because the fact that we are all putting our hearts into something that is a vision, that is like an eternal type of a vision, that sometimes that's where, things can get out of alignment and get out of whack, and feelings can get hurt and all those kind of things, because like this is a job that we all believe matters.
Yeah.
And so that's where sometimes people can step in and abuse, or some people can not be abused but have their feelings hurt and think they were abused because, I'm talking about spiritual abuse, but because because our hearts are so entwined in this thing, And so I love that because I like to look at it like not like I'm your boss and your employee or something. Like we are partners together in this mission to do what God has called us to do as a church. We have different roles, and there is an authority that there's a part of that. Yeah. But I like to look at it like I think we've talked about this before, where Jesus talked with his disciples and said, "I no longer call you servants because the servants don't know what the master is doing. Yeah. I call you friends." And that's the way I like to look at it as a pastor, is like, hey, you guys aren't servants. Yeah. If you were servants, I wouldn't tell you what we're trying to do here. But no, we're friends and we're doing this together. We're partnered together, and that's why I want your feedback and your input, and I want us to, and ultimately I do have to make the final decision on things, but if we're all in this thing together, then we're submitted to one another under the vision of Christ.
Yeah. Another one I had was you become more like Jesus. So Jesus submitted to God's plan for salvation for all humanity. You gain authority. When people know you will submit to them, they will listen to you. And that's just something I've seen as I have the willingness to be teachable and to submit to something. It allows my voice to be heard because they know my voice can be trusted. You create stability. Not a lot more to that one than there's not division because you don't have your own way of doing things. So
I think it's good. Yeah. I mean, just a couple that I added is good witness. That's what the scripture says in, I think it was 1 Peter, where it talked about, submitting to the authorities of the earth, and that others are looking on, that they're seeing that, and they'll see those, the way that you're living there, and it'll be a good witness. And then it talks about that God will bless that, as you are submitted to others and to him, it brings his blessing.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So one of the other thoughts that kind of had on this was just, I submit to the vision, not mine. So not a lot of people can do that. And this is something that is kind of the makeup of the word submission. So the word submission is made up of two words, right? Sub and mission. And what we're essentially saying is my mission comes second to the main mission. Right?
Man, that's so good.
My mission comes second to the main mission. James 4:7 says, all authority comes from God, the creator of heaven and earth, and we are commanded to submit to him. So once we've submitted to God, our highest authority, recognizing and following the chain of human authority in this world becomes a lot easier. And you kind of even hit on that, like the authorities of the earth. And it's this piece where we see in 1 Samuel the story of David and King Saul. Like King Saul throws a spear at him, right? Like there's this level of animosity, and if there's anybody who had a reason to doubt and maybe wonder if submitting to an authority was probably not right, probably would be David.
Sure, yeah.
Right? Because King Saul, his heart becomes hard towards David, right? And because he knows David is going to be the next king. And so David respected King Saul's authority as the one that God had appointed. And God didn't change that until it was David's time.
Yeah, and that was the timing part is a huge part of it. Yeah,
because there were moments in the story that we see that David could have easily, and his friends would tell him, right? They were like, "Oh, he's vulnerable
there he is.
Right now."
God has they were like, God put him in your hands.
Yeah, but he knew that God had appointed him, and he hadn't taken him out yet of that spot. And so David respected King Darius's authority. We see that too, even though he held firm to his belief. Oh, sorry, Daniel respected King Darius' authority. I just went around time.
David was Saul, King Saul.
David, King Saul, and then
but
Daniel,
also with Daniel.
Yeah, Daniel in 6:2. That's where we see that. Even though he held firm to his beliefs and principles, and then Romans 11:36 reminds us that all things are from God, through God, and to God. So he is the highest authority. Jesus himself recognized God's authority and was submissive to it. In John 4:34, Jesus said his purpose was to do the will of him who sent him and to finish his work. And in John 5:30, he says, I seek not to please myself, but him who sent me. Jesus' entire life was one of submission to the Father, culminating with his great prayer of submission just before his death. He said, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will, in Matthew 26:39. If we will be disciples of Christ, we must submit to Christ's authority just as he submitted to the Father's. And so 1 Peter 2:13-14 says this, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. Since all authority comes from God, we are to submit to anyone who is placed in authority over us. In so doing, we submit to God. And so there's this like chain of command, and we kind of talked about that.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that makes it a lot easier. So who do we submit to? First and foremost, we submit to God. Then everyone else becomes easier, because when we do that, we're just obeying God. We submit to the authorities of our life. We submit to our spouse. And I know you had some thoughts kind of there on submitting to your spouse.
Yeah, I think that one where you're talking about submitting to your spouse is one that can be misunderstood sometimes, because that passage in Ephesians where it talks about wives submit to your husbands, I think that can be a little bit controversial. And, sometimes even husbands can take that like, yeah, you're supposed to do whatever I tell you to do. You're supposed to be fully submitted to me or whatever. But it goes on in that same passage to also say that husbands are to lay down their lives for their wife. And so I think oftentimes we think about, the wife's supposed to submit to the husband, but I think it's a lot more of a mutual submission. Where in a marriage you're saying, I submit to you and you submit to me, and together we submit to Christ. And when that happens, when, wives are saying, yes, I'm submitted to my husbands, but husbands are so much easier to submit to when they've got a vision from God and they're leading their family in spiritual things. And then the wife can just kind of come up alongside of them and say, man, I'm getting next to you as we're partnering together to lead our family. And, husbands, when you just start saying, hey, I'm willing to lay down my life for my wife, my wants, my desires, my dreams, like I'm laying them down for you, just like Christ laid his life down for the church. Then suddenly, like, you are like, your wife's like, man, this is a sexy beast. I want to follow him anywhere because he's willing to give me everything that he's got. You know what I'm saying? But most husbands aren't doing that for their wives. And then they wonder, why is my wife not submitting to my leadership and whatever? Wow, but it's not about that. It's like, hey, I'm submitting to you, you submitting to me, we're submitting to Christ. As a husband, I'm laying my life down for my wife in such a way so much like Christ laid his life down for the church. And then when that happens, like, man, there's this mutual submission that takes place there, and it's powerful.
Yeah, that's so good. I know I'd think about, and I've had a conversation with one of my friends recently about this, but they're trying to figure out what the next step for them is, in ministry and life. And I just reminded them and kind of shared with them my story of, when I left Chick-fil-A and, I started ministry again. As I was pursuing the calling and I felt like the nudge to go back into ministry, it was no longer just about my calling.
Yeah.
And in the same way that you had to both be called to the city of Burleson, both be called to planting a church, both being called to, be the lead pastors here. It's that same piece that we need to go, am I submitted to each other's? Because it's not just my vision anymore.
Yeah.
Now our vision is united. And when we don't do that, that's when it becomes tricky. That's when things get
you had to go, hey, I feel like God is calling me back into ministry, but it's not just me anymore. It's us.
Yep.
When I was in ministry before, it was just me, but now it's us. And so I'm submitted here that even though I feel like God's calling me back into ministry, Amy, if you're not on board with that and you're not feeling that calling either, then I'm laying down what I'm feeling because we're in this thing together.
Yep.
And I'm trusting that God's going to speak to you. If he spoke to me, he can also speak to you.
Yep.
And so I'm submitting to that, and I'm not going until you're ready. And if you're never ready, I'm not going because we're one. We're in this thing together.
Yeah.
That's hard.
That is really
hard to do sometimes.
That is really hard. And I think, very often we are the spiritual leaders of the home. And so I think there can be a confusion in that because I'm the spiritual leader, my vision trumps yours. That's not the truth,
that's not true.
And at the end of the day, the marriage is just so important to make sure that that's the piece. And that's the conversation I had with Amy. I was like, if it's not now and it's later, let me know, know? And so we had those conversations. She said, I don't think it's right now. But then as we were going through the process, she's like, now I feel peace about it. And I'm like, thank God. You know what I mean?
And it's so amazing because like our wives have so much of a different perspective.
Yes.
And they bring that perspective into the into the mix, and it makes such a huge difference. And I'm telling you, like, if you try to run over her or you try to run out ahead of her, then you're gonna you're probably gonna be in for trouble. Because they have like a spiritual discernment that's different than ours. And so we submit to that.
Yep.
And when you're submitted to that with her, it's so much easier for her to be submitted to you as well.
Absolutely.
So it's just a powerful picture of the way that we are submitted to Christ. And it's easy to submit to Christ because he laid down his life for us.
Yeah.
As hard as it is to say, not my will, but yours, your kingdom come, your will be done.
So good, yeah.
When you really go, wait a minute, like he gave everything for me. Okay. It's not hard to go, okay, God, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And that's the picture that we see in marriage.
Yeah. So good. I want to share another scripture in Hebrews 13:16 through 17. It says, "Do not neglect to do good, to contribute to the needy of the church as an expression of fellowship, for such sacrifices are always pleasing to God. Obey your spiritual leaders and submit to them, recognizing their authority over you. For they are keeping watch over your souls and continually guarding your spiritual welfare as those who will give an account of their stewardship of you. Let them do this with joy and not with grief and groans, for this would be of no benefit to you." And I just wrote down this thought of, I'm being cared for, so I'm going to care for this. And I just look through my life and I see all the different moments where I remember my pastors or my leaders or my mentors saying, "Hey, I'm praying for you." And back then I was like, "Oh, cool, like you're praying for me." But I didn't realize that they were keeping watch over my soul. In the same way that you are keeping watch over our soul as a team, in the same way that spiritual leaders and parents are keeping watch over your soul. And that picture kind of changes the way I submit to authority, because I no longer just see as this person of leadership that has their own life and has all these things going on, but part of their job and duty as someone I submit to is to watch over my soul. Yeah. And now what's cool is that when the enemy comes to attack me, I only have a limited field of vision. But when I'm submitted under someone, they have an even greater field of vision that they can see around me. And so thank goodness when I am submitted to someone, because when I care about that,
it's a covering.
Yep.
I'm under a covering.
Yep.
That's so good. And there was another part of that passage where it says, make their job a joy.
Yeah.
For if you made it difficult for them, that would be of no benefit to you. Yeah. And I think like there's a powerful thing there. Like if I'm submitted to whoever it is that's in authority over me in such a way that I'm making their job easier and making them have, enjoy their job a whole lot more, actually that turns around and it benefits me too. Like if I'm making life easier for my boss, then he's actually going to turn around, make life easier for me too, know? And so I remember preaching about this one time as a pastor, preaching that passage. Yeah. And I was saying, hey, like, I'm not saying everyone should honor me and whatever, but what I am saying is like when you have this kind of attitude towards your pastor who is a shepherd of your soul, like when you have that attitude, then guess what's going to happen? Like I'm going to be able to serve you better and help you more. Yep. And so I'm like, it's like on, what was that movie with Tom Cruise? Help me help you. You know what I'm saying? That was Jerry Maguire, and I'm like, come on, people. Like, I'm trying to help you. Yes. Help me help you, you know, because it actually, the person who is the one that is submitting is actually benefited because the person they're submitted to is, if you've made it better for them, then they're going to make it better for you. And then, like you said, there's this covering over it. It's a really cool kind of relationship for the way that things work.
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the questions I just kind of had, and it's something I've seen just around me, is that I've just really seen that this generation has a problem with authority. And I think that's part of the reason why they have a problem submitting to people that question everything and doubt anything. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think with good reason, because I think, people have really abused authority in a lot of ways. And, you see it in the world. You see politicians and political leaders and things like that have really abused their authority. And it's really come to a lot more to light in the last couple of years. I see that. But then there's also spiritual authority that has been abused in many ways. And so I think that there is a good reason for people to push back a little bit on authority and to submitting to authority, things like that. And I understand that, but my thought is that just because something has been abused doesn't take away the power of the principle when it is applied correctly.
That's good.
And submission, being under, and later God being able to put you over, and the fact that God has placed all authority into place. He's the one that does that. That's very scriptural, and that we're ultimately all submitted to Christ. How authority and those kind of things work, if that principle is applied correctly, it is powerful. So we should not just completely, throw that principle out just because we have seen it abused in many ways. We don't do that with other things. We don't throw away things that are good things that have been abused. We learn to apply them correctly because there's power in that. And so I think there's a really good reason that people push back against authority, and I understand it. I really do. I've been fortunate where I've mostly served under leaders that have had my best interest at heart, and that makes it easier. And I'm not saying that that it's not hard, because there have been people who have served under authority that has been abusive, and so I'm not trying to belittle that or say that that's not a real thing. But I don't want us to lose the power of this principle from God's word, just because there have been people that have abused it.
Yeah. Kind of going back into that verse and just kind of sharing this last thought. One of the last few thoughts I had was just that last part of that scripture mentions, obey your spiritual leaders, submit to them, recognizing their authority over you, for they're keeping watch over your soul, guarding spiritual welfare, as those who will give an account of their stewardship of you. I remember when I pastored before, there was this leader that just constantly felt like they had to let their ideas be shared and that we'd have to do it their way. And if we didn't do it their way and they thought their way was the right way, then they'd be frustrated and they kind of would create division. And it was this piece that in their heart and what they would say would kind of be around the lines of, well, the reason it matters so much is because it's the students' souls. It's like, I really care about their soul. And I really want them to be discipled. I really want them to be careful. And I'm like, thank God.
Yeah.
I'm glad that is your heart. But what you don't realize is that God's going to hold me accountable. And you're under my leadership. I'm your pastor. You're on this team. And so it's my responsibility when I get to heaven that God's not going to look at you and say, hey, why did Jimmy not experience this? Or why did they not grow in this? They're going to come to me. God's going to come to me and say, hey, Pastor Max, he was part of your sheep, right? And it's coming to me. And so just that scripture just kind of echoes that piece of we need to be able to submit to those that are in our leadership positions and trust that God's going to hold them accountable for the things. And whenever we're like, maybe we want it this way or that way, we go, no, but we're trusting because that's the person that God's put into place.
Yeah.
So do you have anything on that?
No, just that's a heavy weight for anybody that's in authority or in leadership. And the higher you go up in leadership, the more accountability you're going to have to God. And that doesn't mean that there aren't other people that should hold you accountable. In fact, that was my last thoughts, if we're ready for that, was that you never get to a place where you are not under submission in some way. It doesn't matter how high you go up in leadership. You should always have someone that you're submitted to. I like to say it like this. You should never get to a place where you don't have someone in your life that can tell you no.
Yeah.
And I think it doesn't matter how high we go in leadership. We should always know that, hey, we are accountable, first of all, to God, but we are accountable to other people. Sometimes we have to even put those things into, those processes into place, just like here at the church. Like, we started the church, but we set up processes to make sure that we are accountable, that there's reporting, and that there is someone that we're answering to. There are people that can tell us no. We have, overseers. We have a pastor's council. There are certain things certain decisions that we don't just make without going to our pastor's council and saying, this is the kind of decision we'd like to make, but we would like to have your approval on this for accountability process, and they could say no on how we spend that money or whatever. And it's not because they're trying to keep us from doing what God's put in our heart, but just because there needs to be those checks and balances. So you always are going to have somebody that you're submitted to. Yeah. And ultimately we're submitted to God. And when people a lot of times get themselves in trouble because they start thinking, it's pride that starts to think, I don't have to answer to anyone. Yeah. But we do ultimately answer to God. We're responsible to him, and we're going to give account there. But we should also have people in our lives that we're giving account to as well. And it doesn't, like we said earlier, it doesn't mean that if you're someone who's in or under someone's authority, that you can't ask questions and that you can't, all that kind of stuff. But you do that within the framework and with the process. And so, man, this is a great subject. Yeah. Honestly, I thought, wow, I love your heart for this, Pastor Max. When you suggested it, I thought, wow, you want to talk about wow, okay, that's really cool. And I love that this is the way that you honor us and the way that you honor the ministry and the church. And I love your thoughts on this and love your heart for it. And so
thank you.
Love you, dude. I'm excited.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. So, hey, if you're joining us today, we're so thankful that you've watched or that you've listened. And we'd love it if you'd share these episodes with your friends. Go back and watch some of the old episodes too. Like, don't judge us too harshly on some of.
Keep getting better.
We're trying to get better each time. But like us, subscribe, share it out, do all the stuff so that more people can join with us on the We've All Been There podcast. We'll see you next month.